Millionaire kicks out. His wife and twins. After birth, 5 years later, he begs for mercy. The rain fell in relentless sheets, its icy fingers clawing at the windows of the sprawling Westwood mansion. Inside, the air was thick with tension, an oppressive silence broken only by the occasional clap of thunder. Amelia Dawson sat on the edge of the massive bed in the guest room. No, not their room. That was Eleanor Westwood's unspoken decree. Amelia cradled her swollen belly with trembling hands, her breathing shallow. She had grown accustomed to the hollow echoes of loneliness in this house, but tonight the void felt sharper, cutting into her like glass. She was 9 months pregnant, and the twins inside her stirred restlessly, as if they too could sense the turmoil surrounding them. Amelia had once been the kind of woman who lit up any room she entered. Her soft brown eyes carried warmth, and her laughter had a melody that drew people close. But now, as she stared at her reflection in the gilded mirror, she saw someone unrecognizable. Her cheeks were hollow, her skin pale, and her once bright eyes were clouded with fatigue. The life of Amelia Dawson, the waitress with big dreams, seemed like a distant memory. She placed a hand on her belly, whispering softly, "It's okay, my loves. We'll get through this." Her voice cracked, betraying her fear. In truth, she didn't know how she would survive. Richard's cold indifference was a dagger she hadn't prepared for. When she first met Richard Westwood, she had been enchanted by him. He was everything her world wasn't: wealthy, powerful, and utterly captivating. She remembered the way his dark blue eyes seemed to see straight into her soul, the way his touch made her feel like she belonged in a world she had never dared to dream of. Their love story had been swift and intoxicating, like a storm sweeping through her life. Richard's charm was magnetic, and for a brief moment she believed in the fairy tale. But the fairy tale came with a price. The glitzy events, the designer clothes, and the lavish lifestyle were all distractions from the cracks that began to form. Richard was kind at first, but his kindness had limits drawn by his overbearing mother, Eleanor. It was Eleanor who made it clear that Amelia would never be good enough, that she was an intruder in their world. Amelia's eyes flicked to the room around her, its cold opulence a stark contrast to the warmth she had grown up with. The crystal chandelier above cast a pale, sterile light over the antique furniture and Persian rugs. There were no signs of life here, no photographs, no personal touches. It was a museum, not a home. She shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around her. Outside, the rain lashed against the glass, and somewhere in the distance she could hear Eleanor's voice. The woman was like a phantom, always lurking, always watching. "You've been nothing but trouble since the day you stepped into his life," Eleanor had once said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You should be grateful Richard even married you." Those words haunted Amelia. She wondered if Eleanor had whispered the same poison into Richard's ear. It had been weeks since he had truly looked at her, let alone spoken to her with any warmth. He spent more time at his office, or so he claimed, and when he was home, he was a ghost in the house. A sharp pain jolted her out of her thoughts, and she gasped, clutching her stomach. The twins were active tonight, their tiny kicks and movements a reminder of the life growing within her. But instead of feeling joy, Amelia felt a pang of sorrow. Would Richard even care when they were born, or would he see them as another burden, just as he now saw her? Amelia let out a shaky breath, her tears mixing with the rain that blurred the window pane. She couldn't cry, not now. She had to be strong for her babies, but the weight of everything threatened to crush her. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through the few contacts she had. Her mother had passed away years ago, and her friends from her old life had drifted away. The isolation was suffocating. Her finger hovered over Daniel's name. He was her last connection to the person she used to be, a friend who had always believed in her. But what could she say? That she was trapped in a gilded cage, with no way out? The door creaked open, and Amelia flinched. Richard stood there, his tailored suit immaculate despite the late hour. His expression was unreadable, his eyes colder than the rain outside. "We need to talk," he said, his voice flat. Amelia's heart sank. She had been bracing for this moment, but hearing those words still sent a chill down her spine. "Richard," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "if this is about the babies—" "This isn't working, Amelia," he interrupted, his tone devoid of emotion. "You and I— this was a mistake." The words hit her like a slap, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. "A mistake," she echoed, her voice breaking. "Our marriage, our family, it's all a mistake to you?" Richard's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He turned away, his silhouette framed by the doorway. "You'll leave after the babies are born. I'll make sure you're compensated." Amelia stared at him, her tears finally spilling over. "You think money can fix this? You think you can just throw me and your children away like we're nothing?" Richard didn't look back. "This conversation is over." And with that, he walked out, leaving Amelia alone in the storm. Amelia sank to the floor, her hands clutching her belly. The rain outside mirrored the storm inside her heart. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for her twins, for the life she had promised them. As thunder rolled in the distance, Amelia made a silent vow. This wasn't the end of her story. Not yet. Amelia barely slept that night. The storm outside had raged on, but it was the tempest in her heart that truly kept her awake. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on her swollen belly, as if to shield her unborn children from the cruelty of the world they were about to enter. The faint light of dawn seeped through the heavy curtains, painting the room in muted greys. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind in agonizing detail. Richard's cold, dismissive words echoed like a haunting refrain. "This isn't working. You'll leave after the babies are born." She had begged him with her eyes, pleaded silently for even a sliver of compassion, but all she found was indifference. Amelia let out a shaky breath and pressed her fingers against her temples. The thought of leaving this house, the place she had tried so desperately to make her home, filled her with dread. But staying felt just as unbearable. She had once believed that Richard's love would shield her from the harshness of the world. But now, as she sat alone in the cavernous mansion, she realized that love, no matter how powerful it seemed in the beginning, could wither under the weight of doubt and manipulation. Her gaze drifted to the wedding photo on the bedside table. In the picture, Richard's arm was draped protectively around her, his smile genuine, his eyes filled with something that resembled love. Amelia picked up the frame, running her fingers over the glass. Was it all a lie? She whispered to the empty room. Her mind wandered back to the early days of their relationship, to the moments that had made her believe in the impossible. She had been a waitress at a small cafe in Chicago when Richard had walked in, his tailored suit and commanding presence making him stand out like a beacon. He had ordered a coffee black, no sugar, and stayed for hours working on his laptop. He returned the next day and the next until it became a routine. Richard Westwood, the billionaire CEO of Westwood Enterprises, had noticed her. Not just noticed, he had pursued her. Amelia remembered the way he had looked at her, as if she were the only person in the room. But even in those early days, there had been signs, subtle, almost imperceptible. The way Richard would brush off questions about his family, the way his jaw tightened whenever she mentioned their future. She had ignored those signs, choosing instead to believe in the fairy tale. After all, who was she to question a love that seemed so improbable, so magical, and yet the cracks had widened over time. After their whirlwind wedding, Eleanor Westwood had wasted no time making her feelings known. "I don't know what Richard sees in you," she had said during their first meeting, her voice dripping with disdain. "You're nothing but a gold digger." Amelia had laughed nervously, thinking it was some kind of cruel joke. But Eleanor's icy stare told her otherwise. Richard had defended her, of course, but his words had been half-hearted, almost perfunctory. Now Amelia wondered if Eleanor had been right all along. Not about her intentions, she had never wanted Richard's money, but about the impossibility of their relationship. She was an outsider in this world, an unwelcome guest at a table set for royalty. A sharp kick from one of the twins pulled her back to the present. Amelia winced, placing her hand on her belly. "I know," she murmured softly. "You're hungry." She forced herself to her feet, her body heavy with exhaustion. The guest room felt like a prison, its opulence mocking her modest roots. She shuffled toward the door, her bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. The hallway was silent, the mansion's usual hum of activity conspicuously absent. In the kitchen, she found Maria, the housekeeper, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. Maria was one of the few people in the mansion who had shown her kindness. "Mrs. Westwood," Maria said, her warm smile faltering as she took in Amelia's pale face. "Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine," Amelia lied, her voice barely audible. She reached for a glass of water, her hands trembling. Maria hesitated before placing a gentle hand on Amelia's arm. "You should rest." "The babies, I'll be fine," Amelia interrupted, forcing a smile. She couldn't bring herself to tell Maria the truth. Not yet. As Amelia turned to leave, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the hall. She froze, her heart pounding. Richard appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. He was dressed impeccably, as always, but there was something off about him, an edge to his posture, a tension in his jaw. "Amelia," he said, his voice curt, "we need to talk." Maria glanced nervously between them before excusing herself, leaving Amelia alone with Richard. She gripped the edge of the counter, bracing herself. "What is it now?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Richard's eyes flickered with something guilt, perhaps, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Eleanor is coming over this afternoon," he said. "She wants to discuss the arrangements." "Arrangements?" Amelia repeated, her stomach tightening. "For after the birth," he clarified, his tone flat. "You'll need to leave as soon as the babies are stable." Amelia stared at him, her mind reeling. "You're already planning my exit." "It's for the best," Richard said, avoiding her gaze. "This isn't about you or the children, it's about your reputation." She finished bitterly. "Your precious image?" Richard's silence was answer enough. Amelia felt something inside her snap. She stepped closer to him, her voice trembling with anger. "You stood in front of God and promised to love me, to stand by me. Was that all a lie, Richard? Or was it just convenient for you at the time?" Richard's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. "I've given up everything for you," she continued, her voice rising. "My family, my friends, my dreams, and this is how you repay me, by throwing me and your children out like we're garbage." "You don't understand," Richard said, his voice low. "This world, my world, it's not what you think. I'm doing this for you, for them." Amelia laughed bitterly. "Don't you dare pretend this is about anyone but yourself." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was palpable, a storm threatening to erupt. Finally, Richard turned and walked away, leaving Amelia standing alone in the kitchen. As the door closed behind him, she sank to the floor, her body racked with sobs. For the first time since their marriage, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her heartbreak. But as the tears subsided, a new emotion began to take root, resolve. Richard Westwood might have turned his back on her, but she wasn't going to let him dictate her future. Not anymore. "I'll fight for us," she whispered to her unborn children. "I promise you, I'll fight." The mansion felt colder than ever, its sprawling corridors and towering ceilings echoing with an unbearable silence. Amelia remained in the kitchen long after Richard had left, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She traced the rim of her now empty glass with trembling fingers, replaying his words over and over. "This isn't working. You'll need to leave." The man she had once believed would move mountains for her had cast her aside as if she were disposable. Maria returned to the kitchen after some time, her footsteps tentative as she carried a tray of freshly baked croissants. She hesitated when she saw Amelia still sitting there, her face pale and her eyes hollow. "Mrs. Westwood, are you sure you're all right?" Maria asked softly, setting the tray down. Her voice was gentle, but there was no hiding the concern in her tone. Amelia forced a smile, though her lips barely moved. "I'm fine, Maria." Really, Maria didn't seem convinced, but she didn't press further. Instead, she began tidying up the already spotless counters. "Mr. Westwood mentioned that Mrs. Eleanor would be visiting this afternoon," she said cautiously, as if gauging Amelia's reaction. Amelia stiffened, her hands curling into fists beneath the table. Eleanor's arrival was the last thing she needed. The woman had always been a storm of sharp words and icy glares, but now, with Richard turning his back on her, Amelia knew Eleanor would only add salt to the wound. She straightened her spine, determined not to let Eleanor see her falter. "Thank you for letting me know, Maria," she said, her voice steadier now. "I'll be ready." But ready for what? She wondered. A battle she wasn't sure she could win. Amelia retreated to the guest room, her sanctuary in a house that no longer felt like her own. She sat by the window, watching the rain drizzle against the glass. The world outside was grey and blurred, mirroring the storm in her heart. Her mind wandered to her unborn children. She placed her hands on her belly, feeling their soft movements. The twins had become her anchor, her reason to keep going, even when everything around her was falling apart. "I won't let them hurt you," she whispered. "I'll find a way to protect you." The sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled her attention. A sleek black car rolled up the driveway, its glossy surface gleaming even in the dull light. Eleanor Westwood stepped out, her tall, imposing figure wrapped in a tailored grey coat. Her silver hair was pulled back into a severe bun, and her sharp eyes scanned the house as if she were inspecting her kingdom. Amelia's stomach churned. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "You've faced worse than her," she told herself. But even as she stood, her legs felt like lead. The sound of Eleanor's heels clicking against the marble floor echoed through the mansion. Amelia descended the grand staircase, her hand gripping the railing for support. She forced herself to meet Eleanor's gaze, even as the older woman's eyes raked over her with thinly veiled disdain. "Amelia," Eleanor said, her tone clipped and formal, "you look tired." "Good afternoon, Eleanor," Amelia replied, her voice calm despite the insult. Eleanor didn't bother with pleasantries. She motioned for Amelia to follow her into the sitting room. The air in the room was heavy, the tension palpable. Amelia sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Eleanor remained standing, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. "Let's not waste time," Eleanor began, her voice as cold as the rain outside. "Richard has informed me of the situation. He has made it clear that this arrangement is no longer viable." Amelia's chest tightened, but she forced herself to speak. "This isn't just an arrangement, Eleanor. This is a marriage, a family." Eleanor's lips curved into a thin, humorless smile. "Let's not pretend this was ever a real marriage, Amelia. You may have fooled Richard with your little act, but I saw through you from the beginning." Amelia's hands curled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. "You don't know anything about me," she said, her voice shaking with restrained anger. "I know enough," Eleanor replied smoothly. "I know that you've brought nothing but chaos into Richard's life, and now, with these children—" She trailed off, her eyes narrowing. "Do you even know what kind of burden you're placing on him?" "They're his children, Eleanor," Amelia snapped, "his flesh and blood, and they're not a burden." Eleanor's expression darkened. "Richard doesn't need distractions. He has a legacy to protect, a business empire to run. You and those children are liabilities." The words cut deep, but Amelia refused to let Eleanor see her pain. She rose from the couch, her hands trembling. "You can say whatever you want about me, Eleanor, but I won't let you talk about my children like that." Eleanor's eyes flashed with anger, but before she could respond, the door opened and Richard entered the room. His presence was commanding, but Amelia noticed the flicker of unease in his eyes. "Mother," he said, his tone curt, "that's enough." Eleanor turned to him, her expression softening slightly. "I'm only doing what's best for you, Richard." "What's best for me," Richard said, his voice tight, "is for you to stay out of this." Amelia stared at him, her heart pounding. For a brief moment she thought he might defend her, might finally stand up to his mother. But then he turned to her, his eyes hardening. "Amelia," he said, "we've already discussed this. I'll ensure you're taken care of. But this arrangement, it's over." The fragile hope that had flickered in Amelia's chest was extinguished. She felt the walls closing in around her, the weight of their betrayal threatening to crush her. Something inside her snapped. "How dare you?" she said, her voice trembling with fury. "How dare you talk about me like I'm some problem to be solved? I'm the mother of your children, Richard. Does that mean nothing to you?" Richard flinched, but he quickly masked it. "Amelia, this isn't personal. Not personal." Amelia's voice rose. "You're throwing me and your children out like garbage, and you have the audacity to say it's not personal." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice sharp. "That's enough. This is a family matter, and you—" "No," Amelia interrupted, her voice firm. "You don't get to decide what's best for my family, Eleanor. Not anymore." For a moment the room was silent, the tension crackling like electricity. Then, without another word, Amelia turned and walked out, her heart pounding, her mind racing. As she climbed the stairs to the guest room, tears streamed down her face, but her resolve hardened. She had no one to rely on but herself, but that would be enough. She would protect her children, no matter what it took. Standing by the window, she placed her hands on her belly and whispered, "We're going to be okay. I promise you." Outside, the rain had stopped, but the storm inside her raged on. The next morning arrived with a pale grey light filtering through the heavy curtains of the guest room. Amelia hadn't slept. Her body was drained, her mind a tempest of fear, anger and uncertainty. The soft movements of the twins in her belly reminded her that time was running out. She didn't have the luxury of despair. She had to act, if not for herself, then for them. She pushed herself up from the bed, her muscles protesting with each movement. The room was silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. It was a reminder of her impending eviction from this house, this life. In the kitchen, the familiar scent of fresh bread greeted her. Maria was already bustling about, her small frame moving efficiently as she prepared breakfast. The older woman glanced up when Amelia entered, her expression softening with concern. "You look exhausted," Maria said gently, wiping her hands on her apron. "Please sit. Let me get you something." Amelia shook her head. "I'm fine, Maria, really." Maria hesitated but didn't press further. Instead, she placed a plate of toast and scrambled eggs in front of Amelia. "You need to eat," she insisted. "For the babies." Amelia managed a faint smile. "Thank you." She picked at the food, her appetite nearly non-existent. Her thoughts were consumed by Richard's coldness, Eleanor's venom, and the looming uncertainty of where she and the twins would go. Her mind flitted to Daniel, her childhood friend. Could she reach out to him? Would he even recognize the woman she had become? Her musings were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Richard's assistant, a tall, sharp-featured man named Simon, appeared in the doorway holding an envelope. His expression was unreadable, his tone formal. "This is for you, Mrs. Westwood," he said, extending the envelope toward her. Amelia hesitated before taking it. "What is this?" "Instructions from Mr. Westwood," Simon replied curtly. Without waiting for a response, he turned and left. Amelia stared at the envelope, her heart pounding. She could already guess its contents, but the weight of it in her hands felt like a death sentence. Slowly, she tore it open and unfolded the neatly typed letter. It was exactly as she had feared. The letter outlined the arrangements for her departure: a temporary stay at a small apartment in the city, a modest monthly allowance, and a promise to revisit the terms after the twins were born. The words were clinical, devoid of emotion. There was no mention of her marriage, no acknowledgement of her pain. Her hands trembled as she read the final line. "This is for the best." "Richard," she let out a bitter laugh, the sound sharp and hollow in the quiet kitchen. "For the best? For whom? Certainly not for her, or their children." The letter was a stark confirmation of what she already knew. Richard was done with her. Amelia crumpled the letter in her fist, her anger bubbling to the surface. She refused to cry, not here, not now. Instead, she focused on the faint flutter of movement in her belly, the reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. She rose from the table, her movements purposeful. "Maria," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Do you still have that phone I gave you last month? The one I couldn't use because of the faulty charger?" Maria blinked in surprise. "Yes, I kept it in the drawer. Do you need it?" "I do," Amelia replied. "I need to make a call." Maria retrieved the phone and handed it to her. Amelia's fingers moved quickly, dialing the one number she hadn't dared to call in years. Her heart pounded as the line rang, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, a familiar voice answered. "Hello, Daniel," Amelia said, her voice trembling. "It's me." There was a pause, and then his tone softened. "Amelia, is everything all right?" "No," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Nothing is all right." Daniel listened as Amelia recounted the events of the past few months, the whirlwind romance, the marriage, the growing distance, and now the impending betrayal. He didn't interrupt, letting her pour out her heart. When she finally finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "You don't deserve this," Daniel said finally, his voice filled with quiet anger. "None of it." Amelia wiped at her eyes, grateful for his support. "I don't know what to do, Daniel. I have nowhere to go." "You'll come to me," he said without hesitation. "I'll help you." Amelia hesitated. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," he said firmly. "You're family, Amelia, and family takes care of each other." For the first time in weeks, Amelia felt a glimmer of hope. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she wouldn't face it alone. As the call ended, Amelia felt a newfound resolve. She would leave this house, but not as a broken woman. She would leave on her terms, with her head held high. The sound of Eleanor's sharp voice carried through the hallway, pulling Amelia from her thoughts. The older woman entered the kitchen, her eyes narrowing when she saw Amelia holding the crumpled letter. "I see you've read Richard's instructions," Eleanor said, her tone cold. Amelia met her gaze, her voice steady. "Yes, I have." "And?" Eleanor prompted, her lips curling into a smug smile. "Surely you understand this is the best solution for everyone involved." Amelia stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "The best solution? For whom?" "You may think you've won, Eleanor, but I'm not going to disappear quietly." Eleanor's smile faltered. "You're in no position to make threats." "This isn't a threat," Amelia said. "It's a promise. You and Richard may think you can control everything, but you're wrong. I'll fight for my children, and I'll fight for myself." The tension in the room was palpable, the air crackling with unspoken words. Finally, Eleanor turned and walked away, but not before throwing one last parting shot over her shoulder. "You'll regret this, Amelia. Mark my words." As the door slammed shut behind Eleanor, Amelia took a deep breath. Her heart was racing, but she felt stronger than she had in weeks. She wasn't the same scared, naive girl who had entered this mansion. She was a mother now, and she would do whatever it took to protect her children. She glanced at the phone in her hand, her thoughts turning to Daniel. A plan was beginning to form in her mind, a plan to reclaim her life and her dignity. It wouldn't be easy, but she was ready for the fight. The day unfolded with an eerie calm. The storm that had battered the mansion the day before had passed, leaving the air heavy and humid. Amelia woke early, her body stiff and aching from another restless night. The faint glow of morning light seeped through the curtains, but there was no warmth in it, just a pale reminder that time was slipping away. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting protectively over her belly. The twins stirred, their gentle movements grounding her. Today, she had to start putting her plan into action. There was no more time to hesitate or second-guess. She had reached her breaking point, and now she was ready to fight for her future. Amelia pulled a small suitcase from the back of the closet, its worn corners and faded fabric a stark contrast to the pristine luxury of the room around her. It was the same suitcase she had brought with her when she first moved into the mansion, a symbol of her modest beginnings and the dreams she had carried with her. She began packing slowly, her movements deliberate. Each item she placed inside felt like a piece of herself, a reminder of the life she had built and the sacrifices she had made. The simple cotton dresses, the comfortable shoes, and the few sentimental trinkets she had managed to hold on to. She lingered over a photograph of her mother, the edges worn from years of handling. "I wish you were here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You'd know what to do." The sound of a soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Maria stepped inside, her expression a mix of worry and determination. "I thought you might need this," Maria said, holding out a thermos of tea and a small paper bag. "Something to keep your strength up." Amelia smiled faintly, her throat tightening. "Thank you, Maria, for everything." Maria hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her apron. "You're leaving today, aren't you?" Amelia nodded. "I don't have a choice. You're stronger than you think," Maria said softly. "Don't let them take that away from you." The quiet of the morning was shattered by the sound of Richard's voice echoing through the hall. He was on the phone, his tone sharp and businesslike. Amelia tensed, knowing that their paths would cross sooner or later. As she descended the grand staircase, her suitcase in hand, she found him standing in the foyer, his back turned to her. He ended the call abruptly when he noticed her, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the suitcase. "You're leaving already?" he asked, his tone indifferent. Amelia straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze with unwavering determination. "Yes, I see no reason to stay any longer." Richard's jaw tightened. "I told you I'd make sure you were taken care of." "Taken care of," Amelia repeated, her voice rising. "You think throwing me into some apartment with a monthly allowance is taking care of me? You think that's what I need?" Richard's eyes flickered with something guilt. Perhaps, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "This is what's best for everyone, Amelia." "For everyone?" She laughed bitterly. "Don't pretend this is about anyone but yourself. You're doing what's convenient for you, not what's best for me or our children." Richard's expression hardened. "You don't understand." "No, you don't understand," Amelia interrupted, her voice trembling with anger. "I gave up everything for you, Richard. I stood by you, even when your family made it clear that I wasn't welcome. And now, when I need you the most, you're abandoning me." Richard looked away, his hands clenching into fists. "This isn't easy for me either, Amelia." "Then why are you doing it?" she demanded, stepping closer. "What are you so afraid of? Your mother's disapproval? The opinions of people who don't matter?" His silence was deafening. Amelia shook her head, her heart breaking all over again. "You're a coward, Richard, and I pity you." As Amelia turned to leave, Eleanor entered the room, her presence as icy as ever. She looked at the suitcase in Amelia's hand and smirked. "So you're finally leaving," Eleanor said, her tone laced with satisfaction. "Good. You've overstayed your welcome." Amelia paused, her grip tightening on the handle of the suitcase. She met Eleanor's gaze, her voice calm but firm. "You may think you've won, Eleanor, but you haven't. I'm leaving because I choose to, not because you forced me out. And one day you'll realize what you've lost." Eleanor's smile faltered, but she said nothing. Amelia turned and walked out of the mansion, the weight of the past pressing heavily on her shoulders. As she stepped outside, the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the grounds. It felt like a small, silent blessing. The taxi Daniel had arranged was waiting at the edge of the driveway. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, stepped out to help her with the suitcase. "Are you ready, Mom?" he asked. Amelia glanced back at the mansion one last time. It loomed behind her, cold and unwelcoming. She took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes, I'm ready." As the car pulled away, Amelia allowed herself to exhale. The weight that had been crushing her for so long began to lift, replaced by a flicker of hope. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she wouldn't face it alone. The twins shifted in her belly, their movements a comforting reminder of the life she was fighting for. She placed a hand over them, her heart swelling with determination. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. "I promise you." The road stretched out ahead of her, winding and uncertain. But for the first time in months, Amelia felt like she was moving toward something, toward freedom, toward strength, toward a life she could call her own. The taxi's hum was a soft undercurrent to the thoughts racing through Amelia's mind. She sat in the back seat, staring out at the unfamiliar streets of the city. The sprawling mansion and its cold walls were behind her now, but the weight of her departure lingered in her chest like a stone. The driver, a kind older man named Gerald, glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "You all right back there, ma'am?" he asked, his voice gruff but tinged with concern. Amelia blinked, pulling herself out of her thoughts. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet. "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine, not yet. Her fingers absent-mindedly rested on her belly, where the twins stirred. The soft movements were both a comfort and a reminder of her responsibilities. She couldn't afford to falter now. The taxi pulled up in front of a modest apartment building, its brick facade worn but sturdy. The neighborhood was a far cry from the opulence she had left behind, but it felt more real, more grounded. Gerald helped her unload the suitcase, his hand steady as he placed it on the sidewalk. "Do you need help getting inside?" he asked. Amelia shook her head, offering him a small smile. "Thank you, but I'll manage." Gerald tipped his hat and returned to the taxi, leaving Amelia alone in front of the building. She stared up at the chipped paint on the doorframe and the cracked steps leading to the entrance. It wasn't much, but it was hers, or at least, it would be for now. She took a deep breath and pushed open the door, stepping into the building. The hallway smelled faintly of fresh paint and cleaning supplies. A woman with a toddler on her hip passed by, offering Amelia a curious glance, but saying nothing. Amelia felt a pang of longing as she watched the child giggle and cling to his mother. Soon, she thought, soon she would hold her own children in her arms. Amelia's phone buzzed just as she reached her apartment door. She fumbled to pull it out of her bag, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Daniel's name on the screen. "Daniel," she said, her voice soft. "Are you there?" he asked. His voice was steady, a grounding presence amidst the chaos of her emotions. "I just arrived," she replied. "The place? It's small, but it's fine." "Good," he said firmly. "It's a start, Amelia, and you don't have to do this alone. I'll be there tomorrow morning." She hesitated. "You don't have to." "I want to," Daniel interrupted. "You've always been there for me, Amelia. Let me be there for you now." Her throat tightened, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you." That evening, Amelia sat on the small couch in her apartment, her suitcase still unpacked. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. She stared at the walls, their beige paint peeling in places, and felt the enormity of her situation pressing down on her. She had left behind a life of luxury, but she had also left behind pain and betrayal. Yet, the emptiness of this new life was just as daunting. She was alone now, truly alone, with only the twins to keep her company. Her hands drifted to her belly, her fingers tracing gentle circles. "It's just us now," she murmured. "But I promise, I'll make this work. You'll have a better life than I ever did." The twins moved in response, their small but powerful presence anchoring her. She leaned back against the couch, letting the quiet of the room envelop her. The sound of a knock at the door pulled Amelia from her sleep. She sat up, disoriented, the morning light streaming through the thin curtains. Another knock followed, firmer this time. She hurried to the door, her heart pounding. When she opened it, Daniel stood there, a warm smile on his face. He was taller than she remembered, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his green eyes sparkled with a mixture of relief and concern. "Amelia," he said, his voice soft. "It's good to see you." She stepped back to let him in, her eyes welling with tears. "It's been too long." Daniel set a small bag down by the door and pulled her into a gentle hug. His embrace was steady, grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in months. When he pulled back, he studied her face, his expression serious. "You've been through hell," he said simply, "but you're here, and that's what matters." Amelia nodded, unable to find the words to respond. She led him into the small living room, where he sat down on the couch and gestured for her to join him. For the next hour, Amelia recounted everything: Richard's betrayal, Eleanor's cruelty, and her fears for the future. Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression darkening as she spoke. "I can't believe he did this to you," he said finally, his voice tight with anger. "After everything you gave up for him." Amelia shook her head. "It doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I do next." Daniel leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You've always been stronger than you realize, Amelia, but you don't have to carry this alone. I have connections, people who can help you find work, get you back on your feet." Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you, Daniel." "You don't need to," he said firmly. "You've always been like family to me, and family looks out for each other." As they talked, Amelia's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She glanced at the screen and froze when she saw Richard's name. Her heart pounded as she debated whether to answer. "Do you want me to pick it up?" Daniel offered, his tone protective. "No," Amelia said, shaking her head. She took a deep breath and pressed the green button. "Hello?" There was a long pause before Richard's voice came through, low and strained. "Amelia, I need to see you." Her grip tightened on the phone. "Why? So you can try to convince me again that throwing me out was for the best?" "No," Richard said quickly. "I made a mistake. A terrible mistake, and I need to fix it." Amelia's breath caught. She glanced at Daniel, who was watching her closely. "It's too late for that, Richard." "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "I need to talk to you. One last time." Amelia's mind raced. She didn't know whether to believe him or to hang up and close this chapter for good. But one thing was clear: this confrontation, whatever it was, would be the final test of her resolve. As she ended the call, her hands trembling, Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Whatever you decide, Amelia, I'll be here." She nodded, her thoughts swirling. The path ahead was uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't the same woman who had been cast out of that mansion. She was stronger now, and she would face whatever came next with her head held high. The battle wasn't over yet, but Amelia was ready. The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of Amelia's modest apartment, casting soft beams across the worn floorboards. She stood in front of the small mirror in the corner, her reflection staring back at her. There was a heaviness in her chest, an ache that hadn't faded since Richard's call. His words had been raw, almost desperate, but Amelia wasn't sure if they carried sincerity or another layer of manipulation. She adjusted her simple dress, smoothing the fabric over her swollen belly. The twins stirred, their movements grounding her once more. Today she would face Richard not as the naive woman who had fallen for his charm, but as a mother who had fought to reclaim her dignity. Daniel stood by the door, his presence a quiet reassurance. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his tone careful. Amelia nodded, her jaw set. "I need closure, for me and for the babies. If anything feels wrong, you call me," Daniel said, his green eyes steady. "I'll be here." Amelia gave him a small, grateful smile. She grabbed her bag and stepped out, her heart pounding as she made her way to the meeting place Richard had chosen, a quiet cafe on the edge of the city. The cafe was nearly empty, its soft jazz music a backdrop to the occasional clink of cups and hushed conversations. Richard was already seated in a corner booth, his usual air of confidence noticeably absent. His tailored suit fit impeccably, but his face was pale, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Amelia paused at the entrance, taking a moment to steady herself. Then, with her head held high, she walked toward him. Richard looked up, his gaze locking onto hers. For a fleeting moment, something vulnerable flickered in his expression. "Amelia," he said, rising to his feet. She didn't offer him a smile or an acknowledgement. Instead, she slid into the seat across from him, her posture straight, her eyes unwavering. You wanted to talk. So talk. Richard hesitated, his hands clasping the edge of the table. He looked like a man searching for the right words, but his silence only fueled Amelia's impatience. "I don't have all day, Richard," she said, her voice firm. "Say what you need to say." He exhaled deeply, leaning forward. "I made a mistake, Amelia. A terrible mistake. I let my pride and my mother's influence cloud my judgment. I pushed you away when I should have fought for us." Amelia's hands clenched in her lap, her nails pressing into her palms. "You didn't just push me away," she said, her voice trembling with restrained anger. "You abandoned me. You threw me and your children out of your life as if we meant nothing to you." Richard flinched, the weight of her words landing heavily. "I know," he said quietly, "and I hate myself for it. I've spent every day since you left thinking about what I've done, what I've lost." Amelia's resolve hardened. "You lost us the moment you chose your mother's approval over your family. Do you even understand what you put me through? The nights I cried myself to sleep, wondering what I did wrong. The fear of bringing our children into a world where their father didn't want them." "I do understand," Richard said, his voice breaking, "and I know I can't undo the damage I've done. But I want to try. I want to make things right." Amelia shook her head, her chest tightening. "You don't get to decide that now, Richard. You don't get to waltz back into my life and expect me to forgive you." "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, his eyes pleading, "but I can't let you go without trying. I love you, Amelia. I love our children." His words cut through her like a knife. She wanted to believe him, to hold on to the hope that he had finally changed. But the scars of his betrayal were too deep, too raw. "Love isn't enough, Richard," she said softly. "Love doesn't erase the pain you caused. It doesn't rebuild trust." Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table toward her, his hands trembling. "What is this?" Amelia asked, eyeing it warily. "It's the deed to a new home," he said. "I bought it for you and the twins. It's in your name, Amelia, no strings attached. I know I can't fix what I've done, but I want you and the babies to have a safe, stable place." Amelia unfolded the paper, her hands shaking. The address was listed at the top, along with her name in bold letters. She felt a lump rise in her throat, a mix of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "This doesn't change anything," she said, her voice trembling. "A house doesn't undo the past." "I know," Richard said, "but it's a start." Amelia stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deceit. For the first time, she saw a man stripped of his pride, his defenses down. It wasn't enough to heal the wounds, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt in her anger. As Amelia left the cafe, the deed clutched tightly in her hand, she felt a strange sense of relief. The conversation hadn't resolved everything, but it had given her clarity. She would move forward, not for Richard, but for herself and her children. Back at the apartment, Daniel was waiting for her, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "How did it go?" he asked. Amelia set the deed on the table, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks. "It's over," she said simply. "I told him the truth. He's given me a house, but I told him that doesn't change anything." Daniel nodded, his gaze steady. "So what now?" "Now," Amelia said, her voice firm, "I focus on the twins. I build a life for us, a life where I don't have to rely on anyone but myself." Daniel smiled, his pride in her evident. "You've always been stronger than you think, Amelia." 2 weeks later, in a modest but cozy hospital room, Amelia gave birth to her twins, a boy and a girl. Holding them in her arms, she felt an overwhelming surge of love and purpose. They were her future, her reason to keep fighting. Richard visited once, standing quietly at the edge of the room. He didn't speak, didn't try to intrude. He simply looked at his children, his eyes filled with regret and something resembling hope. Amelia didn't ask him to stay. She had already made her decision. As she left the hospital, Daniel by her side, Amelia felt the weight of the past lift. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she was ready to face it. For the first time in years, She felt free. Months later, Amelia stood on the porch of her new home, the twins gurgling happily in their playpen nearby. The house was modest but warm, filled with laughter and love. She had found work at a small marketing firm, and with Daniel's support, she was slowly rebuilding her life. Richard sent letters from time to time, and while Amelia read them, she never responded. She had forgiven him in her heart, but forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation. Her focus was on her children, on the life she was creating for them. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the yard, Amelia picked up her children, holding them close. "We did it," she whispered. "We're free." And for the first time in years, she believed it. Amelia's journey teaches us that even in the face of betrayal and heartbreak, resilience and self-belief can light the way forward. She didn't let her pain define her. Instead, she turned it into strength for herself and her children. It's a powerful reminder that we all have the ability to rise above life's toughest challenges. If this story moved you, inspired you, or gave you something to think about, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our community for more heartfelt and meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.